Thank you very much. 8 years ago, I had this wild idea that I had a new idea for the purpose of Stonehenge, and I went into a Victorian Skeptics meeting, because the best people in the world to test a wild idea and get you back on track onto the PhD you were supposed to be doing are the Skeptics. And I went in and I said, I've got a new idea for the purpose of Stonehenge. Please ask the hard questions so I can get rid of this rubbish and move back. And I have been presenting this now over the 8 years to Skeptics conventions and conferences, and I must thank the Skeptics. It is a force for positive for keeping people with wild ideas either enthused or making them see the light and go back to their original thesis. I must name Stephen Roberts, who put a lot of work into asking me some awfully hard questions. So at the end of 8 years and a PhD later, and the last year's book was the Cambridge University Press book, Knowledge and Power in Prehistoric Societies, which isn't available out the back at $160. Don't bother. The memory code is. In February, I go to the US and UK for their editions. And how is a British population and going to accept an Australian with a totally rational purpose? It is endorsed by a British Neolithic Stonehenge expert. And what are the New Age is going to say when I say Indigenous people have no psychic link to the ground, they are scientific, and they're rational. They're more like us than fundamentalist religion people. So here in half an hour, no, forget it. Technology, why me? In half an hour, you're going to get a tiny bit. What do I push on this? That? Right. So that's all the books. This came out of Crocodile. I'm going to give a very fast one. Yeah, you can keep going if you can. No. And a skeptical novel, but they're the sorts of things I have published. Knowledge and Power academic memory code that's out there, the Australian. The Brits decided they didn't want Stonehenge on the front because they have Stonehenge on the front of so many books, including a lot of Nutter books. So they have put, and the Americans have put Easter Island on, and if I get through all this, you'll understand why Easter Island and a lot of other places fit the whole pattern. I can't stand still at a computer, but I'm going to have to. Okay, what you've got to think about now, we're going to look at the way knowledge works in Indigenous cultures. And this, although I'll use mostly Australian and American Pueblo here, this is true of cultures all over the world. In their mind, because they do not have writing, when you don't have writing, you do have an alternative. That alternative is orality, O-R-A-L-I-T-Y. You don't have literacy, you do have orality. That's my focus. And orality is a method for memorising vast amounts of information very accurately. And an Aboriginal elder will have a complete field guide to all the mammals of their area, add in a field guide to the birds, fish, reptiles, marine life, insects, and we'll hear in a moment about the Navajo and insects. You are talking 1,000 animals now classified. Research on hunter-gatherer cultures have shown they classify to 3 levels, and in pretty good agreement with Western science. Now add another 1,000 plants, all fully classified, land management, resource rights, and medicinal uses. Indigenous medicine is not rubbish. The good stuff has ended up in real medicine. That's all the problem is there, and been refined. They now have astronomy. So some of you may have been reading in the paper on the research on Aboriginal astronomy, Native American astronomy. They watch the skies, and it's a different sort of astronomy in that from cosmology we've heard about earlier, but it is astronomy, and they have some information that is different from what our astronomers have looked at, particularly scintillation around particular objects and so on, and its relationship to water that the astronomers in Australia are looking at. Genealogies, and someone was talking about this with Aboriginal cultures, have not yet been fully understood. They're described as the most complex data sets known. Somebody from another culture or language group will come in and they'll work out all the relationships. So these are all held in memory. complete laws, ethics, and they whack them all into an integrated knowledge system. And Nungarai, who Woolpuri woman that helped me a lot with this, is really down to earth, and she said, which is my gospel, the elders were pragmatic old buggers. Anyone who's not Australian, that's a term of endearment. The elders were pragmatic old buggers. We wouldn't have survived if they weren't. I'm not looking at the spiritual stuff. I am looking at the pragmatic survival information. So I'm not going to read that, but those are the areas that I look at in terms of how do they store, frankly, how the hell do they memorise all that stuff accurately. So I'll give a couple of examples. Do I have any birders present? I usually, hey, thank goodness. Those people will tell you that I've got my birding right or wrong. Rainbow bee-eater is one of our birds. It's migratory. And the way information is stored is linking it. So the Callum people up in New Guinea have mythology. Mythology is a memory device. I'll get that across to you by the end of this talk. Mythology is a memory device. Have I got a clicker? Right, I haven't got a clicker. I'm going to be ready to laugh when I miss. So they can watch the sun going along the horizon to maintain a calendar for planting. Their main crop is taro. It hasn't got a T on the end. There's no cards. They eat it. Their main crop is taro, and although they will use the movement of the sun along the horizon, they then wait for the arrival of the bee-eater, because its behaviour is a better indicator of weather than the sun's position. The bee-eater comes in and stays way up high when it's moist up high. That's where the insects and things are. And then it will drop down, and they know that that's when the rains are coming. Bee-eater arrives, they plant. Memorising that against the couple of hundred birds, at least, that they have, is stored in stories of the bee-eater ancestor, the bee-eater mythological character, and that's how it's made memorable. So recent research, don't try and read that, you're not expected to. Recent research on Australian cultures, there's quite a few examples where the information is accurate going back 7,000 years. They're expecting to take it further back. The stories were recorded before the scientists worked out what they were, and they tend to be landscape information on what the landscape was like before the end of the Ice Age and things were flooded. And I am talking about information retained in memory 7,000 years. My research is on what mechanism could possibly do that. So a kangaroo goes boinga-diddy, whether you are literate or non-literate. What is different is the way you store the information. Indigenous people, if you go back 7,000 years, evolution has not changed us that much in that time. The brain is the common factor. I am getting to Stonehenge, just not yet. By the time I finish the anthropology, you should have solved Stonehenge. So in primary orality, all those things are memory devices. Anything that is sung, for your sake I won't, but anything that is sung is much more memorable than any information just given, which you'll probably be well aware of from your own experience of the songs that you can't get rid of. Indigenous people sing and sing and sing, and they are singing practical information. Mythology are vivid, grotesque stories. And those who came to the workshop yesterday will know the more grotesque. I did implant Donald Trump in everybody's home. Apologies, the rest of you are lucky you didn't get that. But the more the mythology, the more grotesque, vulgar, way up the information is, the more memorable it is. Therefore, to embed that information in mythology is a really effective memory device. Stories, dance can give behaviours in a way everything else can't. I'm not going to do the rest because we haven't got time. So that's why Aboriginal people will say everything got a song, no matter how little it's in the song. And every quote from Aboriginal people do not include gods. Has anyone ever heard an Aboriginal person talking about their gods, or Native American? They talk about the characters, Native American, the Kachina, whatever, that's just particularly group of them. They're stories they tell because it's all about the story. So by embedding information in song, it's more memorable. Embedding it in dance is more memorable because you can act out things that can be conveyed much better in movement than they can be conveyed in dialogue. 7 research has shown, there's lots more research I could go on. There is on my website a bibliography of 800 items, but 70% of the songs in Durbar corroborees are linked to pragmatic information, stored, checked, tested, and scientifically recorded, in that if it doesn't keep working, they change it. The Navajo one study, and to do one of these studies, you've got to have 2 elders, linguists, and ethnoscientists. So it's a hard study to do, but the Navajo classify over 700 insects to 3 levels, all retained in memory. How do they do it? So in Australia, we have performance sites. All, if you notice, that stuff is all performance. By performing knowledge, you know a lot more, you will remember it more by singing it, dancing it, acting it out, making it wildly vivid. So we have, I'm pointing the screen here, but you've got it up there, corroboree grounds, but we also have borer grounds, which are restricted sites. Sorry. So why do we have secret men's business, secret women's business? You'll find that in every culture around the world, secret business. It's because of the Chinese whispers effect. It's also because of power. Knowledge which is restricted gives power. But it's also the Chinese whispers effect. It doesn't matter if the general stories that we hear, which are the stories told to children, are adjusted and moved and changed around. That's the public information. But if you have the survival stories from, 100 years ago, last time they had a really, really bad drought, or you have the agreements between tribes on territory boundaries, all those things have to be kept extremely accurately. The information that goes down 7,000 years tends to be all about the landscape, because the landscape represents ownership, but also the most effective memory method. So you will always get restricted information, and that's where the scientific information is held, among other things, obviously, at higher levels of initiation. So it's kept as secret business. So I'm going to give one example, when I've had some more water, of the way of one of the best studies that's been done on the effect of how ritual and mythology store science. Ritual is a repeated event. Do not think of ritual as hoo-ha, hoo-ha, hoo-ha. That might be in churches now, but in these cultures, they are repeated events. So we're looking at the Pueblo corn colours. The term anasazi is often used. It's highly offensive. That's what the Navajo, who live next door, call the Pueblo, and it means our enemies, and it's very insulting. So it's now called ancestral Pueblo. They keep 7 main varieties, 17 sub-varieties, pure, and have done so for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And corn cross-pollinates like you wouldn't believe. So they have all these different coloured corn. If they planted a complete crop of the yellow sweet corn, and it was a bad season for it, and these are in the American Southwest where the seasons can be quite unpredictable and very dry, if they did that and had a bad season, they all die. It's not something you can get out of. So they plant these in all sorts of varieties, and the way they keep all that information correct is the chiefs of each of the secret societies, but in particular the Corn Society, tells stories which have rituals in it. Those rituals involve selecting the best kernels to be kept for next year as seed, deciding and dictating who can plant where so that the colours don't cross-pollinate, and when so that they're maturing at different times. It's stored through dance and through song, and the proportions to ensure even if they have the worst year on record, there will be enough for them to survive. It'll be the one they don't like eating as much, but they will survive. The book that tells you about the Tiwa, which is one of the Pueblo language groups, Corn Information by Alfonso Ortiz, tells you the stories of the corn mothers and the corn maidens, and the corn maidens are each of the colours, and the stories tell you all this. He tells you to also read Richard I. Ford, who's an ethnobotanist, who looked at this in terms of what I've described as the science. And they tell you that each other, both ways work and get the same outcome. They are different ways of recording it, different ways of knowing it, and to the degree to which the thinking is scientific or not varies within the community, just as it does within ours. So they have a secret societies. They have about 250 ancestral characters. It varies because they keep changing it, called Kachina, who dance and act the information in their kiva, which are subterranean rooms, restricted rooms. That pattern is everywhere. If you're solving Stonehenge in your head at the moment, that's really important, the secret stuff. So they also record that in little dolls that they hand out to the children to learn the characters, which is a foundation to the information system, because those characters tell the stories, and on pots and all sorts of things. So now let's come back to Australian Aboriginal culture, right? I've got 3 minutes before I have to get to Stonehenge. That's the bird, as I'll tell you, where the rest of you probably know, wedge-tailed eagle, as we identify it to Aboriginal people. He's a character, Bunjil. He's the creator character, and there are creation stories everywhere because they tell you what landscape points and what animals were created. So the creation stories give you a complete list of the environment, the landscape, and all the plants and animals. Origin stories are, in fact, an encyclopedia set of subheadings to the information system. So Bunjil created our land. So I have recorded, I've used these memory devices, we'll get to this soon. What it is it's a bit of board with beads on it, I know. A copy of an African memory device. I have encoded the entire field guide to the Victorian birds. The birders are welcome to test me in taxonomic order, 408 of them. To there, I can sing all the families. I won't, for your sake. I have been forced into it a few times. It's painful. But for each one, I have... Ooh, it's upside down. Each one, I have the stories. So this is Laraday, the gulls and terns. And then I have all the stories about how to remember them apart. So the two birders in the audience will know that the top one is the kelp gull, the bottom one is the Pacific gull. They are silver gulls, seagulls, but we're not allowed to say seagulls anymore, on steroids. And on the beach, how do you tell them apart? The Pacific gull has a bit of red on the top of its beak, the kelp gull doesn't. So in my stories, he is the Pacific gull, he is permanently drunk, he's an alcoholic, that's why he's got a red nose, and the kelp gull's a health fanatic. But that's how our field guides show it to us. Once you start doing this sort of thing, that's what they're like. They become dynamic, they become alive. And so my kelp gull and my Pacific gull argue with each other madly on whether you should drink and being a health fanatic and so on. And that keeps the story. But I've also got a human story in there, which is why when you get Bunjil, you'll find that he's also represented as a human. They morph between. And when you read Indigenous stories, once I stopped trying to find beginning, middle, end and analyse, I started to see that all this integrated stuff came together. So I'm going to give one example of life and death dependent, and my horror, although anthropologists have picked me up on this, but I don't care, of the term hunting magic. Magic that is performed before they go out on the hunt, and they claim it works. They claim it works because they have empirical evidence that it works. So one of the things that's done right across the northern hemisphere, so the birders just got worried, unless they birded over there. This is the red-throated loon, which is known from Canada and so on. That's a totem pole, because totem poles tell the stories which encode it. There's the loon sitting up the top. If you go out to sea as a fisherman, you perform the red-throated loon magic before you go out, because the red-throated loon is not pelagic. I have 2, maybe 3 people in the audience who know what I mean. Pelagic birds stay out at sea. The loon does not. So you're out at sea doing your fishing, the weather changes. If you can, from all the birds carrying on like pork chops, if you can identify the call of the red-throated loon, which calls loudly, a very piercing call, and follow it, you will get back to land. You will survive. Fishermen that know that call will therefore have a better chance of survival and bringing their fish back than the others. So they always perform the magic, which includes the song, which has that call in it. So add into it, we're now getting to the exact method, and this gives you the starting point for Stonehenge, Easter Island, and all the rest. Those elders with all that other stuff stuffed in their memory also have a navigational track to the Yanyuwa people. They've mapped 800 kilometres of landscape navigation. One elder in his head navigating 800 kilometres. And it's called a songline. Songlines were made popular by Bruce Chatwin, but for... No, I look there, don't we? But he only talked about navigation. Basically what they are is through the landscape, you walk, and at each place there are sacred locations. Those sacred, meaning important, precious, you perform rituals, repeated events, songs that store information. Those song lines are acting as a set of subheadings to the entire information system. It is the most powerful memory method used. I now have about well over 1,000 locations in action. I'm going to skip that. I'm going to skip that at the moment and go straight to the Brits, to the ancient Romans via Dominic O'Brien, who has endorsed the book, 8 times world memory champions, wildly excited about it. This method was always called the method of loci or loci, locations known to the ancient Greeks and Romans. Cicero, Homer, all of them used it right. It's documented, taught in schools right into the Middle Ages. Basically, as they walked around an area, they went to each location and put a bit of their speech in. And then when they were giving the speech 8 hours in a row, they would imagine themselves walking to location and withdrawing that particular bit. And that embedded it. You couldn't get the order wrong. It was grounded. So they also used, all Indigenous cultures used handheld devices. That's a coolamon, Aboriginal food dish, young girls one, but with marks on the back that were used just like the African lukasa. And it's only since using those that I've realised they are phenomenally effective. So Aboriginal coolamon work the same way. There's an African man of memory, Luba person, using a lukasa, which mine's copied from. There are none of those left, but well documented how they used them. And there's mine. Hey, we got there. 6 minutes to solve Stonehenge. Okay, what you've got up there doesn't matter. That's 500 years into Stonehenge's use. It matters in 500 years, but not at the beginning, that the big guys, the Sarsens, came. So imagine it more like this. This is the Ring of Brodgar up in Orkney, but Stonehenge originally was 56 stones in a circle about 100 metres across with a ditch with segments and flat bottom. I'll get to the flat bottom. I'll get to the segments only if you ask. And so what my question was, standing on Salisbury Plain 8 years ago when I had no idea that I had any interest in archaeology whatsoever, was what happens to a culture that's moving around the landscape and has their information system embedded in the landscape when they settle? They cannot afford to lose that information. They're physical and cultural, but let's stick to physical survival depends on it. And so what they did, I went, oh, beauty, how clever of them. They have localised their set of locations. They've done it in a circle because most information is seasonal and repeated over the annual cycle. It's all much more complex than that, but that's... And so I just went, oh, how clever. It's a memory system. Listened to the tourist thing, and we had things to gods and rituals and sacrifices and stuff. And there's 240 burials, parts of people over 1,500 years. I don't think it's primarily a cemetery. But that idea hit. I then had 8 years, of course, self-doubt hit fairly quickly. I am a skeptic. Why would I have thought of this and no one else? Which is why I started almost immediately bringing these ideas to the skeptics and getting you lot to ask the hard questions. So what you see now, those white dots around the edges are where the bluestones were originally. The big guys in the middle came later. And it became a very restricted site. So you've gone from a very open public site, probably not far from hunter-gatherers, still sharing most of the information, to a site that had a lot of secret places, so modelled more like the African secret societies, the Native American medicine societies, and so on. But I have lost my public site, and as I said, you must have public and restricted sites. But there it is, looking terribly restricted, not like the photos you see when they have a whole lot of pagans there at solstice, because half the stones are missing. So they modelled it using foam, called Stonehenge, and it's very, very restricted. But only 10 years ago, they discovered 3K down the road a site called Durrington Walls. That ditch is cut into chalk. It goes for 1 kilometre. It took 1 million work hours to do, and the only reason that's been granted so far for them to do it, they know it's not defensive because despite the reconstruction, it's flat-bottomed and it doesn't work defensively, is to show they could, or something or other like that. No one is that stupid. They did it for a very good reason. But they also, and I'll get to the reason, they also did henges, wood henges, timber sites. So I had a whole lot of tests in place, and one was if a single set of poles, a single set of stones could not be indexed, could not be sequenced, my theory fell over. Haven't found one yet. So, I don't know if you know anything about British winter, but the archaeology shows that the meetings were mid-winter. What's the chance of them 50 metres in the middle of the circle being able to be heard by people sitting on the bank in the middle of a British winter? They dug ditches because that way they could cover it. The imperative is to perform those ceremonies, because if you don't perform those ceremonies, you lose that information. So they dug the ditches, and what they will have found in chalk, which is a stone, is that the songs, the chalk's white, the songs would have given reverberation and incredible sound effects, and they could cover it, and torches on white must have looked sensational. So once they got to Durrington Walls, they made them much deeper. That deep for 1 kilometre. I want one. They also lined them up and it was only fully lined up accurately after 500 years, and there's good reasons why. The more you're settled, the more you can watch the solstices, and timekeeping is essential. My theory has 10 different aspects in the academic book that must be there for me to be able to claim it's a ceremonial site, and one is it must have these, what archaeologists often call enigmatic decorated objects or memory aids. And yes, they were at Stonehenge in chalk. And then there are the Scottish ones, carved stone balls. I have some wooden replicas because I'm replicating these memory events. That's the Towie ball, the most famous. I showed that to an Aboriginal elder and he said, oh, they made their chiringa in balls. That's really interesting. Now can I tell you something else? One of the world's great mysteries, what were the carved stone balls for? Google carved stone balls and look at Wikipedia and see the crazy ideas that have been suggested and don't match the archaeology, compared to the obvious, to me, that they were memory devices. And problem I had was some of them are 120 knobs, and again my test was if it can't be indexed, then it can't be a memory device. And when I went and examined them in Edinburgh and Glasgow, every single one could be indexed, and I have a replica of that one down there. So now we're going to dash around the world, because the stupid logic of you skeptics was, if your logic is right for Stonehenge, it must be right for every oral culture that's settled around the world. Thanks, guys. That meant I had to look at the whole world. Didn't quite get the whole world done, but did enough. And showed that all these factors were present. Avebury, I assume quite a few have been there, that's a whole village in the middle. That's a ditch after 5,000 years. That's what the ditch is like. Those little guys are archaeologists, and flat-bottomed. It's 1 kilometre long, and they made it with a flat bottom. Why would they do that? Because they were performing down there. Can you imagine chanting down there in the white chalk, torches, and with the acoustics of a bathroom? I beg my husband to dig me one. There is the husband who refuses to dig me. And there he is with the stones at Avebury. Now let's add in the ditch. That's what it would have been like. That is to scale. Those stones are trivial compared to this 1 kilometre long ditch. And until this theory, there is no explanation for it. My theory says it's an imperative that they have somewhere to perform these rituals, songs, and so on. So you've got public and restricted spaces. In England, they like to call them passage tombs and passage graves. This one, West Kennet Longbarrow, has quite a few bodies in it, bones in it, not about 50, which over its use of 1,000 years is not very many. Some of them don't. I'm saying that they were the restricted performance sites in which there were some burials. And that's me at the avenue. As you walk that avenue, pairs of stones come into your focus, then go out. It would work perfectly as a memory system. And there are other sites like Stanton Drew that's a reconstruction. They didn't photograph it 5,000 years ago. Again, the massive flat ditch and all these timber circles. For the archaeology, they know that it wasn't a building. I'm just going to dash through. I won't tell you how terrible Newgrange is as a reconstruction, but it's an amazing site where you have all the factors that I'm talking about. This is an island, and Noth, where you have stones all with decorations on right round. The method of Loki, beautifully done. In Brittany, in France, 3,000 standing stones in lines, and one of the standing stones was 3 times the height of any at Stonehenge. Gavrini Passage, Cairn. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. I now have just been receiving emails from an archaeologist there who says, your theory has finally explained a whole lot of questions he's had there. Hunter-gatherer site, not farming. We've got Malta. Pacific Island, I've nearly got to the end. Easter Island didn't quite work until I realised it's a Pacific culture. Pacific cultures index their information system according to genealogies and use the landscape, but they use the reverse order. That's a genealogy stave from New Zealand. So once you look at the Rarotongans and the Maori, and that's a memory device used by the Pacific navigators, extraordinary knowledge stored in mythology to navigate thousands of kilometres of open ocean. And there's your avenue again, all the information fits. Nazca lines do fit the pattern again, the walking and so on. They can be seen from the hills nearby. You don't need aliens, but you do need to add the rest of the culture in that city in Cahuachi. They can all be walked. Chaco Canyon in New Mexico is the most extraordinary place I've ever been. If I ever discover what spirituality is, that's the place that did it to me. Ancient ancestral pueblo, hopefully someone will ask me about it. So now we're in Illinois, that Cahokia, and right across the Americas there's these pyramids and timber circles, the same size as Stonehenge, about the same number of locations, They certainly didn't have communication 4,000 years apart and umpteen thousand miles. It's the human brain that's the constant. We've now got the Maya, Chichen Itza, we'll skip that, and the Inca. So the Maya and the Aztec, by the time the Inca came along, were literate. The Inca managed to have this massive empire for the whole, right down South America, were non-literate. But what they did have, they set up their whole city, Cusco, using song lines, some real, some imaginary. They called them queques, C-E-Q-U-E, and had shrines along them, which they told the Spanish. This has all been documented by the Spanish, who then mucked it all up. But they're like your books, and they had the most adaptable memory device of all. The Kipu, I'm using one of those, extraordinarily effective. And that's it. I just went a bit over, but I've got there.